In a small, quiet town on the edge of Atlanta, life moved at its own pace. The streets were lined with modest houses, some with chipped paint and overgrown yards. It wasn't the kind of place where dreams seemed to take flight. For 16-year-old Elijah, every day felt like a battle against circumstances that never seemed fair. Elijah lived with his mom in a tiny apartment that always smelled faintly of burnt toast. His mother worked long hours as a cashier at a local grocery store, but no matter how hard she tried, there was never enough money to cover everything they needed. Rent was late more often than not, and sometimes dinner was just a bowl of instant noodles shared between them. Despite all this, Elijah loved his mom deeply. She was strong, even when life knocked her down, and she always told him, "We'll get through this together." But Elijah couldn't help feeling the weight of their struggles pressing down on him. He wanted to do something, anything, to make things easier for her. So when he heard about a part-time job opening at the nearby airport, he jumped at the chance. Loading cargo onto planes wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it paid better than anything else available to a teenager without connections or fancy qualifications. Every morning, Elijah woke up before sunrise. The alarm clock on his bedside table buzzed loudly, jolting him out of sleep. It was an old thing held together with duct tape, but it still managed to wake him up every day. As he rubbed the sleep from his eyes, he'd think about how different his life might have been if his dad had stuck around. His father had left when Elijah was just 5 years old, disappearing without so much as a goodbye. All Elijah remembered was a vague image of a man laughing, carrying him on his shoulders. After that, silence. No calls, no letters, nothing. Just emptiness. The walk to the airport was short but exhausting, especially during the summer months when the Georgia heat was relentless. By the time Elijah reached the tarmac, sweat already soaked through his shirt. His job was simple: load luggage and cargo into the belly of airplanes. Heavy crates, suitcases, and boxes, all of it came his way, and he hauled them one by one into the cargo hold. It was backbreaking work, and by the end of each shift his arms and legs ached like crazy. But Elijah didn't complain. Not once. This was his way of helping his mom, and he took pride in doing it well. What kept him going were the moments when he could pause and watch the pilots walking across the tarmac. They looked so confident, dressed in crisp uniforms with shiny badges pinned to their chests. Their caps shielded their faces from the sun, giving them an air of mystery and authority. To Elijah, they seemed like superheroes, people who had escaped the hardships of everyday life to soar above the clouds. He dreamed of being up there with them someday, flying high above the world below. But deep down, he doubted such dreams were meant for someone like him, a poor black boy from the wrong side of town. One afternoon, while loading cargo onto a plane bound for Los Angeles, Elijah noticed something unusual. A man stood near the cockpit door, watching him intently. The man wore a pilot's uniform, his hat tilted slightly forward, casting a shadow over his face. At first, Elijah thought nothing of it. Pilots often glanced at the ground crew to ensure everything was running smoothly. But this man's gaze lingered longer than usual, almost as if he recognized Elijah. Or maybe it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. As the man turned and disappeared into the plane, Elijah shook off the strange feeling and went back to work. He finished loading the last crate and stepped back, wiping the sweat from his brow. Little did he know that brief encounter would change everything. Life on the tarmac was tough, but Elijah had grown used to it. What he didn't realize was that fate had something unexpected in store for him. Somewhere above the skies, hidden among the clouds, answers to questions Elijah hadn't even dared to ask were waiting to be uncovered. And soon, those answers would come crashing into his world like a storm he couldn't ignore. High above the clouds, in the cockpit of a massive commercial jet, sat a man whose life couldn't have been more different from Elijah's. Years ago, this man had been just like any other kid growing up in a small town, full of dreams and hungry for something better. But unlike many others who stayed rooted in their struggles, he found a way out. He worked hard, studied harder, and eventually earned his wings as an airline pilot. Now, he spent most of his days soaring through the skies commanding planes that carried hundreds of passengers to destinations around the country. On paper, his life looked perfect. To the people who saw him walking confidently across the tarmac in his crisp uniform, he was a symbol of success. Children pointed at him with admiration, and adults whispered about how lucky he must be. But behind the polished exterior and the shiny badges lay a truth he rarely shared with anyone, a heavy burden he'd carried for over a decade. This man wasn't just a pilot. He was someone's father. And not just any father. He was Elijah's dad. The same dad who had vanished from Elijah's life when he was only 5 years old. Back then he was young, reckless, and desperate to chase his dream of becoming a pilot. Life with Elijah's mom hadn't been easy, and the pressure of providing for a family while pursuing such an ambitious career felt overwhelming. When things between him and Elijah's mom fell apart, he made the hardest decision of his life. He left. At the time, he convinced himself it was for the best. He thought she would move on, find someone else, and give Elijah the stable life he deserved. But what he didn't realize was the void his absence would leave behind. Years passed, and guilt gnawed at him every single day. He tried to push it aside, focusing instead on building his career and proving to himself that he could succeed. Yet no matter how high he flew or how far he traveled, the memory of his son lingered in the back of his mind. He often wondered what Elijah looked like now, whether he still laughed the same way or if he even remembered him at all. One day, during a routine layover in Atlanta, he heard whispers about the woman he used to love. Someone mentioned that she was struggling financially, working long hours to keep food on the table. Another person casually added that her son, his son, was helping out by taking odd jobs around town. That piece of information hit him like a punch to the gut. For years he'd assumed she had moved on, rebuilt her life, and given Elijah everything he needed. The idea that they were still fighting to get by broke his heart in ways he couldn't describe. Determined to help, but too afraid to reveal his identity, he began sending anonymous financial aid whenever he could. It started small, a grocery card here, a utility bill payment there, but over time, it became a habit. He told himself it was the least he could do, a way to ease some of their struggles without intruding on their lives. But deep down, he knew it wasn't enough. Money couldn't replace the years he'd missed, the birthdays he hadn't celebrated, or the bedtime stories he hadn't read. Still, fear kept him from reaching out directly. What if they hated him? What if his presence only made things worse? So, he continued living his double life. By day, he was the confident pilot everyone admired. By night, he was a man haunted by regret, staring at old photos of a family he'd walked away from. Whenever his schedule brought him to Atlanta, he couldn't help but wonder if Elijah was somewhere close by, unaware that the man flying overhead was the same one who should have been there to teach him how to ride a bike or cheer him on at school events. Then came the day when fate decided it was time for him to face the consequences of his choices. As he prepared to board Flight 427 bound for Los Angeles, he stepped out onto the tarmac for a quick inspection before takeoff. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the air shimmered with heat. Ground crew members scurried around, loading luggage and securing cargo holds. Among them was a teenager hauling heavy crates with determination etched into every movement. Something about the boy caught his attention. He stood bent over a crate, muscles straining as he lifted it into the plane's cargo hold. Sweat dripped from his forehead, but he didn't stop. There was a resilience in his posture, a quiet strength that reminded the pilot of someone, himself. Maybe back when he was younger and determined to rise above his circumstances. But as the boy straightened up momentarily to wipe his face, the pilot froze. The resemblance was uncanny. The shape of his jaw, the curve of his nose, even the way his eyebrows furrowed when he concentrated, it was all so familiar. Could it really be him? Was this scrappy kid slaving away under the blistering sun actually his son? His chest tightened as emotions surged within him. Guilt, longing, and disbelief collided in a storm of feelings he hadn't anticipated. For a moment he considered approaching the boy, saying something, anything, to bridge the gap between them. But doubt crept in. What would he say? How could he explain years of silence and abandonment? Before he could make up his mind, the boarding call echoed over the intercom, signaling the end of his brief window of opportunity. Reluctantly, he turned away, climbing the stairs into the cockpit and leaving the boy and his unresolved emotions behind. As the plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the sky, the pilot stared out the window, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of the teenager below, the one who bore such a striking resemblance to his younger self. Questions swirled in his head. Had he done enough to support his family from afar? Would Elijah ever forgive him for leaving? Most importantly, did he have the courage to finally confront the past he'd been running from for so long? Up in the clouds, surrounded by the hum of engines and the vastness of the open sky, the pilot realized something he'd known deep down for years. Running away doesn't erase your mistakes. Sooner or later, you have to face them. And for the first time in over a decade, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to reconnect with the son he'd left behind. The days that followed that brief encounter on the tarmac were anything but ordinary for Elijah. He couldn't shake the memory of the pilot who had stared at him so intently. It wasn't just the man's uniform or his confident demeanor that stuck in Elijah's mind. It was the way he looked at him, like he was searching for something. Or someone. At first, Elijah tried to brush it off. Pilots came and went all the time. They didn't pay attention to baggage handlers unless there was a problem. But this man hadn't been looking at the cargo hold or checking the loading process. His eyes had been fixed directly on Elijah, as if he recognized him. Or maybe it was just wishful thinking. Still, the image lingered, haunting Elijah during his shifts and even creeping into his dreams. Elijah wasn't one to dwell on things too much. Life had taught him to keep moving forward no matter what. But this felt different. There was something about the pilot's face, a familiarity that gnawed at the edges of his memory. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became. He'd seen that face before. Maybe not recently, but somewhere in his childhood. A faded photograph, a distant memory. Whatever it was, it unsettled him. One evening, after another long day at the airport, Elijah trudged home feeling drained. His mom was sitting at the kitchen table sorting through papers scattered across its surface. She looked up when he walked in, her tired smile lighting up the room just a little. "Hey, sweetheart," she said softly. "How was work?" Elijah shrugged, dropping his bag by the door. "Same old stuff. Long hours, heavy crates, you know how it goes." His mom nodded knowingly, then gestured for him to sit down. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something," she said, her voice tinged with hesitation. Curious, Elijah pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "What is it?" he asked. She hesitated again, fiddling with the edge of a paper in front of her. Finally, she sighed and said, "You remember that box I told you about? The one with all the old photos? Well, I finally got around to cleaning out the attic today and I found it." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Photos? Like family pictures?" "Yeah," she replied, pushing the box toward him. "Go ahead. Take a look." Curiosity piqued, Elijah opened the box and began flipping through the contents. Most of the photos were yellowed with age, their edges curling slightly. They showed moments frozen in time. Birthday parties, holidays, lazy afternoons spent playing outside. As he sifted through them, one particular picture caught his eye. It was a photo of his mom and dad together, standing side by side, smiling brightly. In the background, barely noticeable, stood a younger version of the pilot he'd seen at the airport. Elijah's breath hitched. He picked up the photo, studying it closely. The resemblance was undeniable. This man, the one in the picture, was the same person who had stared at him on the tarmac. His mind raced as pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. "Mom," he started, his voice trembling slightly. "Who is this guy?" His mom froze, her expression shifting from curiosity to unease. For a moment she didn't say anything. Then, reluctantly, she admitted, "That's your father." The words hit Elijah like a punch to the gut. He stared at her, stunned. My father. But I thought he left us. You always said he disappeared and never came back. He did leave, she said quietly, her eyes filled with sadness. But yes, that's him. And yes, he's a pilot now. I didn't tell you because I didn't think it mattered. He made his choice a long time ago. Anger bubbled up inside Elijah, hot and sharp. How could his own father abandon them, only to live some glamorous life flying planes while they struggled to make ends meet? Why hadn't his mom told him the truth sooner? Questions swirled in his head, each one louder than the last. You should have told me, Elijah snapped, slamming the photo down on the table. All these years I thought he didn't care about us, but he's been out there living some perfect life, acting like we don't exist. His mom reached out, placing a hand on his arm. I know it hurts, sweetheart. Trust me, I've carried this pain for a long time too. But holding on to anger won't change what happened. Your father made mistakes, big ones, and I can't justify them. But he's still your dad, whether you want to believe it or not. Elijah pulled away, pacing the room. His thoughts were a jumble of emotions: anger, confusion, betrayal. He wanted answers, and he wanted them now. Determined to confront the man who had walked out on them, Elijah vowed to find him again. If his father thought he could just disappear and forget about them, he was wrong. Dead wrong. The next morning, Elijah arrived at the airport earlier than usual. His shift didn't start for another hour, but he didn't care. He needed to see if the pilot would show up again. Part of him hoped he wouldn't. It would be easier to stay angry if the man stayed far away. But another part of him, a deeper, more complicated part, wanted answers. He deserved to hear the truth, no matter how hard it might be to swallow. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the tarmac, Elijah kept scanning the area for any sign of the man. Hours passed, and just when he started to think he wouldn't appear, he saw him. The pilot stepped out of the terminal, his uniform crisp and spotless, his cap tilted slightly forward. Elijah's heart pounded as he watched him approach the plane assigned to Flight 427, the same flight he'd worked on the other day. Taking a deep breath, Elijah marched straight toward him. His legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to keep moving. When he was close enough, he called out, "Are you the captain of Flight 427? The pilot turned, startled by the sound of Elijah's voice. For a split second, their eyes locked, and Elijah saw something flicker in the man's gaze. Recognition, maybe, or perhaps guilt. Slowly, the pilot nodded. "Yes, I am." Elijah clenched his fists, trying to steady his voice. "I need to talk to you now." The pilot hesitated, glancing around as if unsure what to do. Then, with a slight nod, he motioned for Elijah to follow him to a quieter corner of the campus. Once they were alone, Elijah held up the faded photograph. "Do you recognize this?" he demanded, his voice shaking with emotion. The pilot's face went pale as he stared at the picture. After a long pause, he whispered, "Where did you get that?" "That doesn't matter," Elijah shot back. "What matters is why you left us. Do you even know what we've been through? Do you care at all?" The pilot looked away, his shoulders slumping under the weight of Elijah's words. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with regret. "I know I messed up. I was young, selfish, and scared. Leaving was the biggest mistake of my life, and I've regretted it every single day since." Elijah scoffed, crossing his arms. "Regret doesn't fix anything. You missed my whole life. You weren't there for birthdays, school events, nothing. How am I supposed to forgive you for that?" The pilot nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "You're right. I don't expect forgiveness. Not yet, anyway. All I can do is try to make things right starting now. If you'll let me." For a moment, Elijah didn't respond. He wanted to lash out, to scream and yell until all his pent-up anger was gone. But looking at the man standing in front of him, the man who had once been his hero, he realized something important. Anger wouldn't bring back the years they'd lost. Only honesty and effort could bridge the gap between them. "I'm not ready to forgive you," Elijah said finally, his voice softer but still firm. "But if you're serious about making things right, prove it. Show me you mean it." The pilot met his gaze, determination replacing the sadness in his eyes. "I will," he promised. "Whatever it takes." As they stood there, surrounded by the hum of engines and the bustle of the airport, Elijah felt a tiny spark of hope ignite within him. Rebuilding trust wouldn't be easy, but maybe, just maybe, it was possible. The days that followed Elijah's confrontation on the tarmac were a whirlwind of emotions for both him and the man who had walked out on their family years ago. For Elijah, anger still simmered beneath the surface, but it was now mixed with something else: curiosity. He wanted answers, real ones, not just apologies or promises, and he wasn't about to let the man off the hook easily. For his part, the pilot didn't run away this time. Instead, he began making small, deliberate efforts to reconnect. At first, it felt awkward and forced, like two strangers trying to piece together a puzzle they weren't sure fit anymore. But as weeks turned into months, those tentative steps started to feel less like obligations and more like genuine attempts to rebuild what had been broken. One of the first things the pilot did was invite Elijah to lunch. It wasn't anything fancy, just a quiet diner near the airport, but it was a start. When Elijah arrived, he found the man already seated at a booth, nervously tapping his fingers against the table. Seeing him in plain clothes instead of his uniform made him seem almost human, vulnerable even. "Thanks for coming," the pilot said as Elijah slid into the seat across from him. His voice was softer than usual, stripped of the authority it carried when he commanded an airplane. Elijah shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "I'm here because I want answers, not because I trust you." The pilot nodded, accepting the truth in Elijah's words. "Fair enough. Ask me anything." So Elijah did. He asked why he left all those years ago, how he could abandon his own son, and whether he ever thought about them during the years he was gone. Each question was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. The pilot answered honestly, though. His voice cracked several times as he spoke. He admitted he'd been selfish, scared, and overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility. He talked about the guilt that had haunted him every day since he walked away, and how he'd tried to help anonymously, sending money whenever he could. But Elijah wasn't ready to soften yet. "Money doesn't fix everything," he said firmly. "You can't just throw cash at us and think that makes you a dad. You missed my whole life. My birthdays, my school plays, my struggles, you weren't there for any of it." The pilot hung his head, unable to argue. He knew Elijah was right. No amount of money or excuses could erase the years he'd lost. All he could do was try to make up for it now, however imperfectly. Despite his lingering resentment, Elijah couldn't deny that the man sitting across from him seemed sincere. There was no arrogance, no defensiveness, just raw honesty and regret. Slowly, reluctantly, Elijah began to open up a little too. He talked about growing up without a father, about the nights he'd cried himself to sleep wondering why his dad didn't love him enough to stay. He shared stories about helping his mom scrape together rent money, about working long hours loading cargo just to ease her burden. The more he talked, the more the walls between them began to crack. As the weeks went by, the lunches became a regular thing. Sometimes they met at the diner. Other times they grabbed burgers from a food truck near the airport. They weren't perfect conversations. There were still moments of tension, silences that stretched too long. But they were honest. For the first time in years, Elijah allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to have a father again. Then came the day when the pilot showed up at one of Elijah's high school events. It was a basketball game, and Elijah was playing guard for his team. He hadn't told the pilot about it. He figured the man wouldn't care anyway. So when Elijah glanced into the stands and saw him sitting there wearing a hat and cheering, loudly his heart skipped a beat. After the game, Elijah approached him cautiously. "What are you doing here?" he asked, trying to sound indifferent but failing miserably. "I wanted to see you play," the pilot replied simply. "You were amazing out there." Elijah looked down, embarrassed but secretly pleased. "Thanks," he muttered. From that point on, the pilot started showing up more often, at track meets, science fairs, even parent-teacher conferences. At first, Elijah bristled at the attention, worried people would ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. But over time, he realized it wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about showing up, being present, doing the things a father should have done all along. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift at the airport, Elijah came home to find a package waiting for him on the kitchen table. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a handwritten note to Elijah. I know I can't change the past, but I hope this helps you write your future. Love, Dad. Elijah stared at the note for a long time, his chest tight with conflicting emotions. Love? Could he really call this man Dad after everything that had happened? He wasn't sure. But the gesture meant something. It showed effort, thoughtfulness, a willingness to meet Elijah halfway. Inspired by the gift, Elijah decided to give his father another chance, not because he fully trusted him yet, but because he owed it to himself to see if they could build something real. Together, they started spending more time together outside of work and school. The pilot introduced Elijah to the world of aviation, taking him to the airport on weekends to watch planes take off and land. He explained the mechanics of flight, pointing out the intricate details of each aircraft. To Elijah's surprise, he found himself fascinated by it all. You ever think about flying? The pilot asked one afternoon as they stood side by side on the observation deck. Elijah hesitated before answering. I don't know. Maybe. Well, if you're interested, I can teach you, the pilot offered. There's a flight school nearby. I could enroll you if you want. Elijah blinked, caught off guard by the suggestion. Flying had always seemed like a distant dream, something reserved for people who didn't come from neighborhoods like his. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't so far out of reach after all. I'll think about it, he said finally, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Over the next few months, Elijah threw himself into learning everything he could about aviation. With his father's encouragement and financial support, he enrolled in ground school, studying aerodynamics, navigation, and meteorology. It wasn't easy balancing work, school, and flight training, but Elijah thrived under the challenge. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was working towards something bigger than himself. Through it all, his relationship with his father continued to grow. It wasn't perfect. They still had disagreements, moments where old wounds resurfaced, but they were learning to navigate them together. Forgiveness didn't come overnight, but it came bit by bit, earned through patience, understanding, and shared experiences. By the time Elijah earned his private pilot's license, he had transformed in ways he never thought possible. The boy, who once loaded cargo onto planes, now stood confidently in the cockpit, ready to command his own destiny. On the morning of his first solo flight, his father sat proudly in the passenger seat, tears streaming down his face as he watched his son take control of the aircraft. As the plane soared above the clouds, Elijah glanced over at his father and smiled. They had both come a long way since that fateful day on the tarmac. Through pain, perseverance, and a lot of hard work, they had found their way back to each other. And now, as they flew side by side, they were finally heading toward a brighter future together. Elijah's journey toward forgiveness wasn't a straight line. It was messy, unpredictable, and filled with moments that tested both him and the man trying to step back into his life. There were days when Elijah felt like he was making progress, when he could look at his father without feeling the sharp sting of betrayal. But there were also nights when old wounds reopened, reminding him of everything they had lost. One evening, after a particularly tough day at flight school, Elijah came home exhausted. His mom was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup on the stove. She glanced up as he walked in, her expression softening when she saw the tension in his face. You okay? She asked gently. Elijah sighed, dropping his bag by the door. I don't know, Mom. Sometimes I feel like I'm letting myself get too close to him. What if he leaves again? What if this is all just temporary? His mom turned off the stove and sat down across from him. Honey, I can't tell you. what to do or how to feel. But I will say this. Your dad has been consistent these past few months. He shows up. He tries. That doesn't erase the past, but it does show he's serious about being part of your life now. But why should I trust him? Elijah shot back, frustration creeping into his voice. He left us when we needed him most. How do I know he won't do it again? His mom reached out, placing a hand on his arm. You're right to be cautious. Trust isn't something you give lightly. It's earned. But shutting him out completely won't heal anything either. You have to decide what's best for you. Not for me, not for him, but for yourself. Elijah nodded slowly, absorbing her words. Deep down, he knew she was right. Holding on to anger wouldn't bring back the years they'd lost. But letting go of it? That felt impossible sometimes. The next morning, Elijah arrived at the airport, earlier than usual. His shift didn't start for another hour, but he needed time to clear his head. As he leaned against the railing overlooking the tarmac, he spotted the familiar figure of his father walking toward him. The man carried 2 cups of coffee, holding one out as he approached. Thought you could use this, he said, offering a small smile. Elijah hesitated before taking the cup. Thanks. They stood side by side in silence for a while, watching planes taxi down the runway. Finally, the pilot broke the quiet. How's flight school going? It's hard, Elijah admitted. A lot harder than I thought it would. That's normal, the pilot replied. Learning to fly takes patience and grit. But I've seen you handle tough situations before. You've got what it takes. Elijah glanced at him sideways, unsure whether to believe the compliment. Why are you doing this? He asked suddenly. All of this, showing up, paying for flight school, cheering me on at games. Why now? Why after all these years? The pilot took a deep breath, staring out at the horizon. Because I messed up, Elijah. I made choices I'll regret for the rest of my life. Leaving you and your mom was selfish, and no excuse can justify that. But I'm here now because I want to make things right. Not just for you, but for me too. I need to prove, to both of us, that I'm not the same guy who walked away all those years ago. Elijah studied his face, searching for any sign of dishonesty. All he found was sincerity. Still, trusting those words was easier said than done. As weeks turned into months, their bond continued to grow, though it remained fragile. One Saturday afternoon, the pilot invited Elijah to join him for a flight. Not as a passenger this time, but as co-pilot. The idea terrified Elijah. He'd only recently started practicing takeoffs and landings, but he couldn't resist the challenge. They climbed into a small Cessna, the kind used for training flights. The cockpit was cramped, filled with dials, switches, and instruments that still felt foreign to Elijah. His father sat in the pilot's seat, guiding him through each step of the pre-flight checklist. Okay, you ready? The pilot asked once they were cleared for takeoff. Elijah gripped the controls tightly, his palms sweaty. Not really. That's okay, his father reassured him. Just focus on the basics. We'll do this together. With trembling hands, Elijah eased the throttle forward, feeling the plane accelerate down the runway. For a brief moment, panic surged through him as the wheels left the ground. But then, as the earth fell away beneath them and the horizon stretched endlessly ahead, a sense of calm washed over him. He was flying. You're doing great, his father said, his voice steady and encouraging. Now let's level off. For the next hour, they soared above the countryside, the world below reduced to a patchwork of greens and browns. Elijah followed his father's instructions, learning how to adjust altitude, maintain speed, and navigate using landmarks. By the time they returned to the airport, he felt a newfound confidence, not just in his ability to fly, but in himself. After landing, they sat in the cockpit for a few minutes, catching their breath. Elijah looked over at his father, gratitude bubbling up inside him. Thanks for teaching me, he said quietly. It means a lot. The pilot smiled, pride shining in his eyes. You earned it, kid, every bit of it. Despite these moments of connection, Elijah still struggled with lingering doubts. One evening, after a long day of studying for his written exam, he confronted his father again. "What happens if I fail?" he asked abruptly. "What if I'm not good enough?" His father set aside the book he'd been reading and turned to face him. "Failure isn't the end, Elijah. It's part of learning. Trust me, I've failed plenty of times in my life. But every time I did, I picked myself back up and kept going. That's what matters. Not avoiding mistakes, but pushing through them." "But what if I let you down?" Elijah pressed. "What if I disappoint you?" His father shook his head firmly. "You could never disappoint me, son. Just showing up, putting in the effort. You've already proven more than I ever did at your age. Don't worry about failing me. Worry about proving to yourself that you can do this." Elijah swallowed hard, the weight of his father's words sinking in. Slowly he began to realize something important. His worth wasn't tied to anyone else's expectations. Not his mom's, not his teacher's, and certainly not his father's. It was his own to define. Months passed, and Elijah's skills improved, steadily. He aced his written exam and mastered complex maneuvers during practice flights. On the morning of his check ride, the final test required to earn his private pilot's license, he woke up early, nerves buzzing in his chest. His father met him at the airport, dressed in his uniform despite having the day off. "You ready for this?" he asked, clapping a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "I think so," Elijah replied, forcing a smile. "But I'm nervous." "That's normal," his father assured him. "Just remember everything we've practiced, and don't forget, you're stronger than you think." The check ride itself was grueling. The examiner put Elijah through a series of challenges designed to test his knowledge, skill, and decision-making under pressure. For hours, Elijah navigated simulated emergencies, performed precision landings, and answered technical questions without missing a beat. By the time he touched down, his shirt was soaked with sweat and his hands were shaking. "Well done," the examiner said as they taxied back to the hangar. "You've earned your license." Elijah stared at him, stunned. "Really? I passed?" The examiner grinned. "Absolutely. Welcome to the skies, Captain." Tears welled up in Elijah's eyes as he climbed out of the plane. Waiting for him on the tarmac was his father, arms open wide. Without hesitation, Elijah rushed into his embrace, letting the emotions overwhelm him. In that moment, all the pain, struggle, and doubt faded away, replaced by pure joy. As they stood there, surrounded by the hum of engines and the vastness of the sky above, Elijah realized something profound. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about choosing to move forward together. And for the first time in years, he truly believed they could. The day after Elijah earned his private pilot's license, the world seemed a little brighter. The weight that had been pressing down on him for so long, the anger, the doubt, the fear, felt lighter, like he was finally stepping out of a shadow he'd lived under for years. For the first time, he allowed himself to dream bigger. He wasn't just the kid who loaded cargo onto planes anymore. Now he was someone who could soar above the clouds, free from the limitations life had once placed on him. That morning, Elijah woke up early, unable to sleep past sunrise. His mom was already in the kitchen, humming softly as she made breakfast. She glanced over her shoulder when she heard him shuffling into the room and smiled warmly. "You look different today," she said, flipping a pancake. "Like you're carrying less." Elijah chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I guess I am. Feels weird, but good." She set a plate of pancakes in front of him and sat down across the table. "You know your dad's proud of you, but more importantly, you should be proud of yourself. You worked hard for this, Elijah. Don't forget that." He nodded, picking at his food thoughtfully. "Yeah, I know. It's just, I never imagined things would turn out like this. A year ago, I didn't even think about flying. Now here I am with my own license." His mom reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "Life has a funny way of surprising us when we least expect it. Just remember where you came from and how far you've come." Later that afternoon, Elijah met his father at the airport. They were going on a celebratory flight together, something they'd planned days earlier. As they walked toward the hangar, Elijah noticed how much easier it felt to walk beside him now. There was still a part of him that guarded his heart, but the walls between them weren't as high as they used to be. When they reached the plane, a sleek Cessna waiting, gleaming in the sunlight, his father handed him the keys. "Your flight, Captain," he said with a grin. "Where do you want to go?" Elijah hesitated, glancing at the open sky. Then, without thinking too much, he replied, "Let's just fly. No destination, no plan. Just up." His father raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "Sounds perfect." As they climbed into the cockpit, Elijah took a deep breath, letting the familiar hum of the engine calm his nerves. This time there was no examiner watching, no checklist looming over him. It was just him, his father, and the endless expanse of blue ahead. Once they were airborne, Elijah guided the plane higher, leaving the city behind. Below them, fields stretched out like a patchwork quilt, dotted with tiny houses and winding. Up here everything looked small and insignificant, even the struggles that had once felt so overwhelming. After a while, his father broke the silence. "You ever think about what's next after this?" Elijah shrugged, keeping his eyes on the horizon. "I don't know. Maybe commercial piloting school? Or maybe I'll stay local for a bit, build up some hours." "Why?" "Well," his father paused, choosing his words carefully. "There's something I've been wanting to tell you. Something I haven't said before." Elijah glanced at him, curious. "What is it?" His father sighed, leaning back in his seat. "I'm not just proud of you because you got your license, Elijah. I'm proud of the person you've become. You've handled everything life threw at you with strength and grace, and honestly, that's something I'll never stop admiring." For a moment, Elijah didn't respond. He focused on the controls, pretending to adjust the altitude, but inside his chest tightened. Hearing those words, from the man who had once abandoned him, meant more than he cared to admit. "Thanks," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "That means a lot." They flew in silence for a while longer, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Elijah spoke again. "Do you think we'll ever really fix things between us? Like, completely?" His father considered the question, his expression thoughtful. "I hope so. But if we're being honest, I don't think fixing is the right word. What happened between us isn't something we can erase. All we can do is keep working at it, day by day, step by step. Forgiveness doesn't happen overnight, neither does trust. But I believe we're headed in the right direction." Elijah nodded slowly, understanding what he meant. Forgiveness wasn't a finish line. It was a journey. One they were both committed to taking, no matter how long it took. Weeks turned into months, and Elijah continued to thrive. With his license in hand, he started taking on small jobs as a pilot, ferrying supplies to remote areas, and giving sightseeing tours to tourists. Each flight brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to prove himself. Slowly, he began to see a future for himself, one where he wasn't defined by his past, but by the choices he made moving forward. One evening, after returning from a particularly rewarding flight, Elijah found his mother and father sitting together in the living room. It was rare to see them in the same space, let alone laughing and talking like old friends. When he walked in, they both looked up, smiling. "We were just talking about you," his mom said, patting the couch beside her. "Come sit down." Elijah hesitated, then joined them. "What's going on?" His father leaned forward, his expression serious but warm. "We wanted to talk to you about something important. Your mom and I have been discussing it for a while now." Elijah's stomach flipped. "Okay. We know we messed up," his mom began, her voice steady. "Both of us. We let our problems get in the way of being the parents you deserved. And while we can't change the past, we can make sure you know we love you, and that we're here for you now." Tears welled up in Elijah's eyes as he listened. He'd spent so many years feeling like he was on his own, like no one truly understood what he'd gone through. But sitting there, surrounded by the two people who mattered most, he realized something. They weren't perfect. None of them were, but they were trying, and that was enough. "I love you guys too," he said quietly, his voice cracking. "And I forgive you." Both of you." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then, almost instinctively, they pulled him into a hug, a messy, tear-filled embrace that said more than any apology or promise ever could. Years later, Elijah stood on the tarmac of a bustling international airport, dressed in his own crisp pilot's uniform. Behind him loomed a massive commercial jet, its engines roaring as passengers boarded for a transatlantic flight. As he prepared for takeoff, he glanced up at the control tower, where his father stood watching proudly. In that moment, Elijah thought, back to the boy he used to be, the one hauling heavy crates under the blazing sun, dreaming of a better life. He thought about the pain, the struggle, and the moments of doubt that had shaped him. And he thought about the family who, despite their mistakes, had given him the tools to rise above it all. As the plane lifted off the ground, soaring into the vastness of the sky, Elijah smiled. He wasn't just flying, he was proving that no matter where you start, the sky is never the limit. It's just the beginning.